Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Compliance Moving Forward. I'm Lois Engström, the Marketing Manager here at CloseMatch, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Danny Gao, who's going to be moderate our panelist of industry experts. But before I hand it over to Danny, let's just quickly cover two key items. This webinar is live. That means that you all have an opportunity to ask the panelist a question. You could do so by typing a question in on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar is being recorded. That means that all of you who have signed up to watch us live today will receive an email later with a link to the recording. So you can either rewatch it, or you could share it with a colleague or share it with a friend. So that's the updates from my side. I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. I hope you all will enjoy it. So Danny, I'm going to pass it over to you now to introduce the topic and the speakers.
Thank you, Lois. And I'll firstly ask our speakers to come off mute so they don't try and speak before. But thank you, Lois, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I hope at least some of you are enjoying the sunshine whilst listening to this today. We have a truly global audience of compliance and technology professionals around the world. And I know from some of the questions we've received, you are eager to learn more about what you can do to help the businesses you work for or with and the teams in the new normal. We will focus on three main topics that have come through the questions so far. And please, you can send questions throughout the webinar. We will answer some as we go, and we will answer some questions at the end of the webinar. Firstly, we will talk through what we have seen in the last few months. Then we will discuss technology's role going forward. And finally, we will summarize on what compliance teams need to consider as they plan for the future. So let's kick off the conversation by firstly understanding the backgrounds and the current roles of our esteemed panelists. So let's start with Rose, and then we'll go to Evgeny, Mark, and Vasil to introduce yourselves and your background.
Thank you, Danny. Yes, so I'm Rose Chapman, and currently I am Principal Tutor and Anti-Money Laundering and Compliance Programme Development Manager, really, for the Financial Services Institute based at the University of the West Indies on Tortola in the British Virgin Islands. Now, this is a role that requires me to prepare from legislation and some from courses prepared by the International Compliance Association for industry players and the regulators. So the Financial Services Commission and the Financial Intelligence Unit here as well. So going well, very busy, great. And I've come from a career as a compliance, head of compliance ultimately, global head of compliance ultimately for a company called Travelport, which was a travel technology company suffering hugely now, as it happens, of course, with this awful virus. But they have financial services too. So I've been through several sectors of the industry, working my way up to global head of, and holding the controlled functions of compliance officer and money laundering reporting officer along the way. So I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm sure we're going to have a great webinar.
Thank you, Rose. And hi, everyone. I'm Evgeny, the CEO and founder of CloseMatch. And by background, I come from financial services industry where I was working on legal and compliance and working on regulatory implementation and remediation projects since 2009. Hence why CloseMatch was born to help with my own frustrations when I was doing the job. And to help compliance professionals and compliance teams to work smarter and better, faster.
Thanks, Jay, and hi, everyone. My name is Mark Flinders. I'm a partner in the financial services business at PA Consulting Group. PA's a global consultancy organization of just short of 3,000 people. We work across 9 different sectors. Financial services is our largest private sector and fastest growing. Within that team, I look after our risk and compliance work. My background is in doing that for the last last 16 years. And as part of that, I've worked for just under 5 years at the UK Regulators, so the Financial Services Authority, and later becoming the PRA and FCA. And more recently, I help regulated firms, predominantly global banks, to adopt new regulations and respond to regulatory fashions and interrogation points.
Hello, Jay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. My name is Vasily Foka. I'm a co-founder and a managing partner at Thales Capital. Thales is a London-based venture capital firm. Been 11 years investing in various technologies companies, and fintech, regtech, compliance tech, and legal tech were one of the core areas we've been investing in Series A, Series B, and C stages. And among our portfolio companies, we have quite established players like Avalara in tax automation. We have Darktrace and SensorNet in information security. We have companies in compliance like CloseMatch and Luminance. We have ID verification businesses, ID on Feeder, and a few others. So we've been very familiar with the space, and I'm super excited in terms of the prospects where the RegTech and compliance tech is offering to institutional investors and venture capital funds going forward, which I'm happy to share on this call.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's great to have such a varied mix. We have regulators, compliance officers, consultants, solution providers, all discussing the same topic of moving forward on compliance today. So my first question is to all of you. We'll go in the same order we just provided introductions. We don't need to say we've lived in crazy times over the last few months, but we've obviously seen some positives and negatives changes off the back of those last few months. Can you all just share a bit of your experience of what you've seen over the last few months in relation to how compliance teams are working and what they have had to consider? And please share any stories of some of the challenges and opportunities as you do so. So Rose, I'll come to you first.
Okay. So of course I've just started a new role here in Tortola, and having arrived here, this is a very friendly and personable place. Everybody wants to be friendly, see you in person and chat. And of course, I was here, I arrived March the 9th, and very, very quickly after, by the following week, there was social distancing and no meetings and no one at the college buildings. So we went from really, I think pretty much the whole community here went from being an in-person community to an online and remote community in a matter of days. This has thrown up a number of challenges, as you might expect, and everyone has learned very, very quickly how to use the technology. Now, having worked in London in financial services for 25 years, obviously I'm fairly au fait with all of that, but it's still been a challenge. And the government departments here and the colleges, and the compliance officers, they're all having to learn how to use Zoom, how to make sure that they do have records, etc., that they are they're producing, and no one can come and look at a document anymore. I mean, this has been going on gradually over the years, hasn't it? No one can come and see your documents. You have to have them online in a format in which they can be viewed from anywhere in the world, really, anytime. So there's been a huge move forward, and the Compliance Officers Association here has been putting out some webinars that I've attended one or two of, whereby they're assisting, really people are helping each other to move forward with the technology and embrace the new world, the new normal, I expect that we'll continue to call it. But there's huge change here in the British Virgin Islands at the moment towards the embracement of technology.
Okay, Jay, I'll come to you next on the same question. What have you seen? Obviously now sitting in the solution side, what have you seen over the last 3 months? Obviously working with a lot of the people listening to this webinar as well.
Well, we have certainly have seen some challenges that our clients and banks that we work with went through. A very simple challenge is suddenly everyone is working from home and people couldn't access files which were stored on their desktops in the office. And Rose was talking about this, but we actually have seen it firsthand, where the people who we work with couldn't actually access their files. Another part we've seen is that communications over Zoom or any other video communication tools are working great, but then actually compliance teams don't have tools today to record their decisions, record the audit trail, record the changes that they're making to address the new environment. And that has posed problems with remote regulatory exams. It has posed problems with providing evidence because everything is remote now, and a lot of communication needs to be written, and for compliance teams specifically, needs to be written in a specialized, technology solution which provides that evidencing capability. And we have seen a rush towards new compliance projects where, enabling collaboration, enabling decision making and recording, but also enabling that view of the state of compliance of the organization, because previously that used to be spreadsheets and SharePoint, which is not really suitable anymore in the new world.
Thanks. Mark, you're obviously, as an organization and personally working with a lot of different companies, I'm sure you've seen firsthand some of the changes we've seen over the last few months in organizations. Not just technology, we're going to come on to technology, but it'd be good to hear a little bit more around the people side and the structure side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd probably pick out 5 things, and the first one, has to be remote working, like Rose and Jay has mentioned, and really, the decreased proximity of compliance staff from the business staff that they're working with, and it making that more challenging to maintain the same level of business engagement that compliance staff like to have. Particularly in the markets business, we see a lot of compliance staff actually sitting on the market floors with the traders, and although that is still happening in isolated pockets, it's obviously not happening as much. So that accelerated use and adoption of collaboration tools and different ways of maintaining that engagement with the business has to be the first thing. The second thing I would say is the frequency, nature and focus of interactions between compliance and the regulators that they're working for. So we've seen a lot of interactions obviously become remote with the regulators, where a lot of meetings before would have been face to face. The nature of those interactions are less consistent as they were before. So there's a lot more interaction on ad hoc topics as the regulators need to find out certain things relatively quickly, and compliance teams need to respond to that. There's been a big shift in the priorities of regulators. So a lot of their regular meetings will have stopped and been replaced by particular other focuses, but whilst also continuing to focus on big programs like LIBOR. And there's been a massive increase in the amount of management information that regulators are asking compliance teams to provide on a relatively short basis. I'd say that the third thing that's been causing a challenge is all of that has been happening whilst there's been a continued focus on a lot of the existing compliance initiatives. So things like the LIBOR program, things like people getting ready for Brexit in the UK in particular, haven't gone away, and that's kind of causing a very kind of peak in workload for compliance teams. The fourth one is the business that the compliance teams are supporting is changing at a rapid pace to also respond to this crisis. Different products have been launched, government lending schemes are being supported, and therefore compliance is needing to stay abreast of that and obviously exercise their compliance due diligence over it. And then the final thing I would say is probably a shift an evolution in the types of regulatory compliance risks that teams are working in. I know we're going to come on to talk about that a bit more in terms of what are the new and emerging risks. I won't say too much about that now, but obviously that's a key thing that compliance teams are really challenged by at the moment.
Thanks. And still, same question to you. What have you seen over the last few months from an investor perspective?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because we, as venture, of course, we have 50 companies in our portfolio. And of course, when coronavirus hit, we've been doing triaging and understanding which portfolio company was impacted, to what extent. So we had like 3 buckets, sort of red that been impacted in the hospitality space, sort of neutral, and then of course you have green that actually had a positive impact from the perspective that actually there was a boost of services that been required. And all the compliance and RegTech portfolio companies were actually growing like crazy in that particular period. And the main reason is that exactly for what Mark just mentioned, what Rose just mentioned, is that we are seeing that we've been in an unprecedented experiment. And I think the Microsoft CEO Satya said, I think we've achieved in 3 months what we've been budgeting over 3 years in terms of people being forced to do those things that in most of those compliance and maybe reg offices within those organizations were sort of good to have, but not sort of mandatory or not something they will be doing across all of their tasks. For example, we have a company on Feeder. I mean, they had unprecedented growth across ID verification in US and in Europe. And for example, now in discussion with US guys to issue immunity passports, for example, if you will be then available to go to work, assuming you have coronavirus, as an example. Yeah. Luminance had unprecedented quantum of data being crunched remotely. I mean, we know that compliance officers, lawyers have been using various tools, but when you're all at home, there's only 1 or 2 or 3 solutions that they probably had it on their systems, but they were not really using, maybe 3-5%. And when they have 100% of their workforce now been forced to try it and use it, and we've seen how easy this is accessible. I mean, I'm sure Jay will talk about close match, a lot of interest from the US guys. I think all of those sort of things that we've been seeing even pre-coronavirus is just accelerated phenomenally, which actually plays really well across all the value chains. So from ID verification, onboarding, KYC, risk analytics, reporting, everything that is basically was on this monolithic legacy solutions. Now people are now realizing they need to onboarding much quicker all the new RegTech solutions. Another thing which we've seen is that the RegTech and compliance has seen huge budgets being allocated. So we already know that the compliance is probably about 15 to 25% of various costs within the larger financial institutions already. And I think, of course, for them, the only way to go and reduce those costs is actually to onboard this RegTech. And I think the forecasts that we've seen in terms of what people are expecting in terms of quantum of the checks, for example, on KYC, is to go 10 times by 2023. And of course, this all been pushed by all the new technologies to be used. So I think we believe this is what we've seen like fintech revolution post 2009. I think this is probably another wave we'll see in compliance and RegTech that is taking place these days.
Great, thank you. And Jay and Mark, I'm going to pick up on a couple of points you just said before. I can see the panel is itching to talk about technology, so we're going to come to technology in a lot more detail. Before we do that, Jay, maybe I'll come to you first, but we're clearly living in different times. That's an obvious, and we will see more remote working. I think that's clear. What's unclear is to what degree remote working versus office-based working we'll see going forward. But what new risks do you foresee? And more importantly, how do we control these going forward? How do we control the risk related to more remote working, more remote teams, etc., from a compliance perspective?
I would say, well, from what we've seen is one of the major risks that I'm seeing personally is the budgets being delayed for technology deployment in compliance and risk, and actually institutions falling behind the times, purely because pausing right now is actually a huge risk, because right now is a great time to reevaluate projects, reevaluate the innovation that is required, because people have more time to focus and more time to actually work on these projects. And we have seen, for example, in the US, Department of Justice just released a guidance on compliance technology, and the fact that banks need to adopt compliance technology, because doing compliance and the reporting compliance in a way that they've been doing it for the last many years is not suitable anymore, especially with people working remotely. And Mark mentioned MI information is being more and more asked by regulators. That information cannot be collected today if that information is sitting in emails, spreadsheets, and Word documents. And specifically, we've seen a lot of interest in renewed interest in policy management software, and that is everyone realized that, okay, we need to brush off the business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. We need to update them, communicate them to employees, and suddenly you realize that the systems are not suitable for that. And in fact, in that guidance, Department of Justice did say that you need to have a different, modern approach to policy management, because that is the main way how you communicate to employees the changing environment of regulations and changing environment of the world.
Thanks. And Mark, same question. What new risks do you foresee?
Yeah, so I'd agree with that, and I think the crisis generates a spike in a whole broad range of risk types across a regulated firm, and that's not just because people are working remotely. It's because market conditions have changed. There's governance schemes in place. There's a whole host of things that trigger risk right across the risk taxonomy. If I was to think about through the lens of remote working regulatory compliance risks, I'd probably pick out 4 risks and 1 miscellaneous. So the first one would obviously be information control and information security risk. You've got the need to ensure that inside information, in its formal sense, continues to be appropriately identified and handled, so that the risk of insider dealing is limited, the risk of insider market abuse risk is limited, and maintaining the appropriate levels of market surveillance and suspicious transaction reporting, especially given the fact that people are working remotely and the markets are particularly volatile at the moment, is the first area that I would pull out. The second would be conflicts of interest risk. You got people working remotely, talking to their partners, their friends, family more that actually might work in other organizations. You have less control over that information exchange and the interactions that are happening. Conflicts of interest would certainly be one. Conduct risk, which is relatively new to most organizations as a risk type or risk consideration, but it's relatively complex as this situation is relatively unprecedented. You've got corporate and retail clients with forbearance proceedings in place at the moment. You've got to think about how you're going to exit those forbearance proceedings with the relevant conduct considerations. You've got the regulators reaching out. There's a Dear CEO letter from the Financial Conduct Authority a week or so ago, talking about they've already seen conduct failings in how corporate clients are being treated when firms are negotiating their new and existing debt facilities. Plus, you've got a whole different mix of vulnerable customers, and that population has changed. So conduct risk would certainly be one. And then I think change risk. So the business is changing very quickly and will continue to change very quickly, and regulatory compliance's ability to stay on top of that and ensure compliance through it is increased during this time. They are the 4, and I'd say that the kind of 5th miscellaneous one has to be just the people risk within the compliance department itself. You know, you've got teams now that are going to be working remotely for a prolonged period of time, and you know, managing the morale, the fatigue, the resilience of that workforce, yeah, has to be on the agenda as well.
Thanks. So let's move on to technology. Let's cover the technology topic. We all know compliance technology is not new. It's been around for a while now. It's not brand new to the market, but we certainly see the market maturing and investment in technology, as Vasil alluded to. It's really becoming no longer optional, which I think is a big change that we've seen where in organizations. Vasil, maybe I can start with you. You gave some good stats there around the 10x by 2023 and about the percentage of cost related to compliance in organizations. Why are you seeing now, what's causing, is it just the amount of regulation is increasing and therefore people can't do this manually? What are the reasons you're seeing from an investor perspective, again, on why the compliance industry is now sort of utilizing technology to the adoption rates that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think some people are saying that the compliance tech is a spin out of the fintech. And I think what fintech we've seen is that digitization and user behavior change, what people are now used to have as a standard, people are calling it Amazon effect, where people now, their behavior changed to the point that with click of the button, they get the service they want. And if you're not getting that, they get frustrated and have negative reviews and are already considering leaving that provider to another one. And it's not just related to the e-commerce. This is basically being impacted across the whole service industry. So financial services, as a result, been heavily impacted. We've seen, of course, the neobanks now been offering really good services, and then all other institutions follow the suit. And in that case, what we're also saying is that there was almost what they called regulation tsunami happened quite recently with so many new regulations that have been taking place. So I think there were some interesting stats. So I think there are about 750 regulators globally issuing 201 daily regulatory alerts a day. And this basically comes to the compliance officer mailbox or whatever system they're getting those. There are 2,500 plus compliance rule books. If you think about the phenomenal quantum of penalties that have been issued, only in 2019 alone, we've seen 500% increase in the penalties that FCA issued to various financial players in the market. So if you think about it, it's like the pressure comes from multiple. So you want to reduce the time needed to client on board. You want fewer fines and litigation costs. You want to adopt new regulation faster. You want to improve the data analytics. You want to improve the regulatory reporting time. All of those things been pushed hard by the regulator. It's been an increasing number of and the complexity of this regulation is shifting that it's basically impossible to deal with the existing solution. So, and then from that perspective, RegTech was sort of getting traction, but I think we're now at that junction where it's not about good to have that tool or this tool. It's almost like if you don't have it, you're actually missing it out big time. And I think we're seeing this across the spectrum of all the compliance and regulation technology. So think about sort of different phases that we've seen in the RegTech. So people still, some of the companies still use Excel spreadsheets for the sort of manual processing. Then there was workflow automation piece where people were looking at compliance software that will be sort of establishing consistent workflow. Then you have continuous monitoring as the phase. And now we're going into sort of what we call phase 4, where it's all about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how you actually proactively identify risks and manage them, both the risks and the reporting. And I think all of that, it just creates huge opportunity. So, and another interesting shift is coming to that, what we're discussing, the behavioral changes. Also, what is happening on the consumer front is that before, all the companies were looking, for example, on the consumer protection side. These days, it's not about consumer protection. It's about the data protection. So now the models have changed. So now you have to sort of safeguard with the GDPR rules and all those new regulations coming in place. how to actually deal with this data. Before, for example, people focused on the capital regulation frameworks. Now people are saying, okay, now the trading is done mostly by various algorithms. How do you do algorithm sandboxing, and how do you actually comply that system with the regulation? People are now talking about API compliance. Before it was reporting compliance. Now with open banking and API, you have to be on the forefront of that change. So all of those new technologies and the startups that we're seeing and scale-ups manage to deliver better, quicker, and much more value-added services. And of course, in the last 10 years, a lot of the incumbents were trying to replicate it in-house, but they realized it's much more expensive. They're probably not fit to do this in-house, and now they're much easier onboarding new solutions. And we've seen this with CloseMatch and other companies that sort of progressing well with multiple clients. Great.
Those points really resonate well with me. I worked for a compliance tech company 10 plus years ago. We were talking about 45 regulatory changes every single day. And as you said, it's actually higher than 201. It's more like 250 regulatory changes every single day, which is just an enormous amount of change to be able to deal with as a compliance team and compliance officers. Jay, I'll come to you. You have worked in both compliance teams and now on the technology side. What types of changes are we likely to see to compliance systems and processes?
I think there are, well, the role of compliance has changed significantly in the last 10 years. And what we have seen initially since the financial crisis is that the compliance teams grew in numbers massively. But then as time went on and the implementations of new regulations went on, banks and also regulators started to realize that manual processes actually don't show very well how regulation was implemented, and hence why we started seeing more and more compliance tools, RegTechs, addressing specific points of compliance, like for example transaction monitoring, fraud detection. There are a myriad of tools now which help with that, and innovative tools brought by startups now obviously growing massively in compliance. But then the second part is that, as Vasil said, the world is changing from the user behavior and what users expect. In fact, our very first client, a large global bank, the compliance COO, when choosing the solution, one of the main reasons why they wanted to bring CloseMatch on board, it's a funny story, but he said, if I cannot show my son the technology that I'm implementing and be proud of that, I don't want to implement that solution. And unfortunately, with incumbent solutions, you don't get that user experience that people come to expect in their daily lives, but they want to have those types of tools at work as well.
Thanks. And Rose, you've been in head of compliance and ethics roles as well as on the regulator side. What changes do you see to the speed of adoption of technology?
Well, I see that with the massive increase in the amount of regulatory and legislative change around the world and the new requirements that are put upon it, coming from a global role where we were in 66 countries and doing business with several more, we would go to local legal teams and get their guidance from a single connection with them. And of course, this comes at a cost. So when regulatory change is slower, that cost may well be less than the cost of adopting a technological solution. But what I can see there being is at this tipping point that it appears to me that we must be pretty much at by now, whereby it's impossible to take regulatory change from all 66 countries, amalgamate it into your global policies, and then apply it best practice across the world, and then also comply with the local requirements. That takes time. It's possible, that's what people have been doing, but it takes time. So with so much change and so much regulatory interest these days and so high fines in different jurisdictions, I think that there is this tipping point where it will be the most sensible thing for the head of compliance to recommend and seek to follow is to get a RegTech answer that will enable him or her to amalgamate all of these changes into the company compliance, risk and compliance system as quickly as is humanly possible or machinely possible. But, you know, to get those changes in, because regulations don't worry about the time it's going to take. Oh, this isn't very reasonable. They want the results now. And therefore, to me, the costs of employing all these lawyers across the world to give you guidance, to amalgamate it, to put it into something, I think those days must be pretty much gone, because it's not possible to have that much information available to one that quickly to enable the incorporation into the global compliance arena of the firm. So I think we're there.
Great.
Mark, I just
wanted
to add to that, and Rose, thank you. You actually highlighted one of the points that we have seen over the last 2 years in global banks, where regulators suddenly started asking to map regulatory obligations to policies and to controls. And what we have seen is that for global banks, there are tens of thousands of obligation items in a spreadsheet or in a GRC system, and tens of thousands of controls, and also thousands of policies, which all need to be mapped. And when you think about the relationships between all of these items in the organization, it's impossible, humanly impossible to do that in a speedy manner. But also, once it's all mapped, you actually need to maintain that, because the regulations, the policies, and the controls, these are dynamic environments which are changing all the time. And if, you know, a static map is not going to do it anymore. It needs to be dynamic, and there is only one solution, and that is an engineering approach to compliance in terms of how to solve these problems that cannot be solved by people.
Yeah. It's essential to keep the pace to remain compliant. It's absolutely essential. If you can't keep the pace, you've lost it.
Yeah, I always remember the quote, which is, if you think compliance is expensive, you should try non-compliance, which a lot of people I know now trying to use is when they're working on their business cases. So I'm really conscious that the time has almost gone. I can't believe how quickly our discussion went, but I wanted to sort of wrap up, and then we'll have, please keep your questions coming in. There's quite a few that have come through already. Some I've tried to weave into the conversation so far, but others I'll wait and answer in a moment. So given the world has changed, and I think, Vasily, as you stated, what we've seen in 3 months has sort of been 3 years. I've heard sort of between 3 and 10 years, actually, what's happened to the industry is what's happened in 3 months has happened between 3 and 10 years in terms of the speed of change. So my question to you all, and let's go down the line again, maybe Rose, we start with you, go to Jay, Mark and Vasily. What do compliance people need to consider going forward? And if you can give one piece of advice or one piece of comment to managing compliance going forward, then that would be great too.
I think that the most essential thing is to embrace the bigger picture, not decide that it doesn't matter to you actually because your business hasn't changed. It does matter to you, it matters to your business. You need to move with those times and embrace that change. And I think it's going to be a huge leap of faith, perhaps, of people who are senior in their roles, who are concerned about the effects of adopting new practices that maybe won't work. But I think that that's the big challenge is still, for me, a people challenge, because you need your people to run your business. However, I think that the biggest challenges going forward are going to be still the adoption of the new tech, but hugely helped should the resources become available to implement. And of course, with this awful virus and the slowdown in many people's balance sheets and profits and losses, that's balancing all the wrong way, then what are they going to invest in? And they need to be making the decisions to invest in something that's going to keep them safe going forward, despite the current economic conditions. So that would be my input.
Thanks. Jay, coming to you next.
Yeah, from my side, I think one thing is, as one of our investors, former CEO of SunGard, said, in times of crisis like this, no idea is a bad idea. And it's when big leaps are made, and slowing down and putting things on pause, especially in areas as important as compliance, would actually be, I feel, detrimental to the industry. And this is something that, I say, rather than slowing down, reevaluate and double down on innovation, double down on technology, and double down on these projects, which in times which are slow can actually deliver a lot faster and better results to the organization.
Yeah, I'd agree with those, Danny. I'd probably add, the three things that I'm talking to most of my clients about at the moment are, firstly, how do we embed the new things we need to do post-crisis into our day-to-day lives. So, things like providing management information to regulators, which has been ad hoc during the crisis, will no doubt become BAU going forward. Remote working probably won't continue to the extent it has, but will continue in some way, shape, or form. So how do we adjust to that? Transitioning out of the forbearance arrangements that we've been talking about might take several years. How do we kind of roll that in? And looking back at all the decisions that we made during the crisis and making sure that they were handled appropriately are all things that compliance people are going to need to tackle as they transition out of the crisis. So that would be the first one. The second one would be efficiency. So, as Rose said, all institutions are going to be under financial performance pressure. Compliance teams have grown in the past. They don't have any less work to do, but they might be under pressure to do that with less people. So, increasing the use of automation technology, for example, chatbots, control automation, whatever it may be, increased use of workflow technology, looking at the use of more codifiable rules and policies internally that can be more automated in the first line are all things that my clients are exploring at the moment. And then the final thing is recognizing that the business is going to change, and a lot of businesses at the moment are looking at how they can increase their pace of change, increase their agility, even restructure around the delivery of value to their customers. And that is not just something which needs to happen in the business. The compliance teams that support those business lines need to consider what their future engagement is going to look like with how those business lines do business. And it's probably going to look and feel a lot different to how they interact today. And I think that that's something that should be at the forefront of the thinking around how compliance structures and operates going forward.
Thank you. And finally, Vasil.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I sometimes bring parallels with the cybersecurity sector. So when the changes were implemented, I think 2009, 2010, where the responsibility for the cyber breaches were brought all the way up to the board level. And before those things, if any had a cybersecurity breach, it was, this is IT department, that's not our issue. And basically the IT guys struggled to have a budget. They struggled to go through the approval process to onboard those systems. They were mostly legacy solutions. Nobody really cared about the problem. And then when the CEO and the top level executives got responsible for those breaches and they could have been fired, there were some criminal investigations, people start realizing this is a serious point and it's just not an IT department. I think we're coming to the point where compliance is getting to a very similar stage where you can't just say, oh, this is compliance department issue. I think this is a fundamentally corporate issue. And I think this has to be within the DNA of each company that is going forward. So they have to think about all the processes and systems from the perspective that the data that we have from the customers, the way we communicate with them, is basically fundamentally where the value of the business is. And if we're not controlling it, if we're not compliant with it, if we're not secure with this, there is no business in 5-10 years. And that's what we've been saying to a lot of businesses. I think you all need to bring a hat being a technology business first, and then whatever you've been doing second. I think, and don't just say, oh, we use technologies because everybody else is using. I think that's basically changed. We're all now seeing that if you're not a technology company in your DNA, with all the latest solutions that you want on board, that you want the board to be upfront for that, and not trying to limit, sort of have this limited risk appetite for risk. That all the way has to come from top level. But I think the regulator, the same with the cybersecurity, probably stepping up, and I think we will start seeing more and more of those things becoming almost like a must-have, and not something that is only just compliance department is looking after. I think that's where we see most of those actual budgets coming through now.
And I think it's been really, really interesting discussion. I think about 70% of the questions have all been related to, I would call it the same topic, related to cost. Either we're getting more pressure as a compliance team, are maybe the revenues of the company are going down or have gone down over the last few months. We've had cost-cutting exercising over the last few months, but we still need to be spending more on compliance and on compliance technology. How do we prove, and what business cases do we need to do to make our organization realize that compliance technology needs to be invested in? So I don't know who wants to take that question. I'll sort of open it out. Rose, I can see you are happy to take it, but the question is all about cost of compliance is going up. It sounds like that's a necessity. How will the cost be offset? How do we fight for our cause of
fight for the cause?
Yeah,
I'm thinking of the fight for the cause as having just come from the role. What I would say is we're talking here about the compliance department as though it is a separate thing, really, slightly from the firm. I prefer these days to embrace the notion of the governance, risk and compliance department. Governance is essential. It's all part of regulatory compliance as well. All compliance officers are managing risks. So governance, risk and compliance. If you're doing a pitch to your board or whomsoever senior management to get some funding in, I wouldn't be focusing in on, oh, we've got to be compliant, we've got to be compliant. I would be focusing it in on, by being compliant in this way, we are improving our governance and we are better managing our regulatory risks, which has to be good for the company, because then we're less liable to have fines that come from being inadequate in our processes and procedures. So that is, whilst you've been speaking, that would be my pitch.
Thank you. Any other final comments from Mark or Evgeny or Vasily around that subject?
I just encourage people to find a way to prove concepts. So, there's lots of great technology out there. Some will work and some will not work. Finding the ways that the business case can be proven in an isolated way, either small pilots, proof of concepts for minimal expense, and either failing quickly or proving the concept quickly, and then going into bat with a credible business case to roll that out wider is always a sensible way forward.
I can add from my side, I think when we look at the problems that the compliance startups or scale-ups are facing when they're selling to financial services organizations and other sort of larger enterprises, I think they have like three major sort of bottlenecks and problems. One is complicated approval process. So they just sometimes don't know where to go, how to get there. And of course, every startup and scale-up will be looking for somebody that will take up that flag and try to promote that solution internally, maybe through the POC, as Mark was saying, or at least trying and erring and introducing a few of his colleagues. So I think it's critical to a lot of people just think about, maybe I should be that person that understand a bit better that solution, try to promote and be that internal sort of advocate of that solution and at least try it. Another thing is that dealing with legacy systems, I think, of course, there is a lot of monolithic structures that basically are not scalable. So of course, somebody within the compliance department should probably work hands in hands with even IT guys, saying, guys, we do need to introduce those systems that will require, let's say, API solutions, will require cloud architecture. What could be done so we actually on the forefront, on the back end of this. And of course, I think the communication with those scale-ups that, again, some of them are not the most experienced in that place. So if the compliance department can actually be that helping hand and educating those guys that sell those new solutions, what is the best way, what is the best entry point to those large organizations, that probably will be very helpful.
Thanks. Evgeny, we're out of time, but I will pass the floor to you for the final comment on this subject.
I would say I would agree with all the comments. And one thing, for example, I would do today if I was still in the compliance department is become best friends with the innovation groups and best friends with technology groups, and understand how the organization is buying technology, and understand what are the processes and how do we cut corners in order to try and pilot and, or even sign up for a short period of time for a service, software service that delivers that, innovation and compliance. And if you actually know that, then it's much easier to get the business case through, because you have a way to try the technology, you have a way to bring it into the bank. And that's usually one of the biggest hurdles for the teams to bring technology into the bank. It's how do you get a smaller company or innovative company through the procurement process?
Right.
Yeah.
Lois, I know I'm 1 minute over, but I think we've done well on time overall. Back to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Danny. Mark, Rose, Vasil, Danny, Jay, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your insights and knowledge with us. For all of you who have been listening in, I hope you enjoyed it. We are running these webinars pretty regularly, so please do check out closematch.com for the next ones. I hope to see you all there. Until then, please do take care and have a nice